longer treatment. So, does the Westminster Confession of Faith touch on political theology? Right? Green light means yes, yellow light means it's not clear, red light means no. Yeah, okay. So, that's a joke. Of all of the topics we're going to touch on, none of them is more disputed than what the Westminster Confession of Faith, what the Westminster Standards say about government. All of the four major positions we're going to touch on today are going to claim in good faith that the Westminster Standards agree with their position. So it can be a little unclear. So more accurately, we're going to go with the yellow. I'm just going to point you in the areas that matter for further review. This is a gift, as always, a reminder that we have copies of the Westminster Standards for free for you in the church library in my office. Obviously, chapter 25 on the civil magistrate is specifically about this issue. The original version, written in the 17th century, was a great deal different. The original version specifically prescribed that the civil magistrate do things like punish and root out heresy, promote good doctrine, and perhaps most potently, gave the civil magistrate the right to call church councils to settle matters of doctrine, and gave the magistrate the ability to weigh in on those church councils. When the Presbyterian Church first associated in America, it was actually 1729, but after the American Revolution and America became its own country, it made sense for the churches to kind of reassociate again. So in 1789, the Presbyterian churches in America, it's not the PCA, but our forefathers, the PCA's forefathers, amended the Westminster Confession of Faith, led in no small part by John Witherspoon, who was the president of Princeton Theological Seminary, and actually one of the signers of the Declaration. Yes. We always get those two confused with the Constitution. It was Declaration, taught James Madison, so he's kind of a founding father. They changed the Westminster Confession in chapter 25 a great deal. It's a big change. So again, if you want to look at what those changes look like, but it certainly removed those commendations. It no longer, our copy of the Westminster Confession of Faith no longer says that it's the duty of the civil magistrate to root out heresy, to promote good doctrine, and certainly we disagree that they have the right to call church councils. So what the Westminster Confession now does is it rules out something called Erastianism, which is just a fancy word meaning that the state has authority over the church. That is completely ruled out by the Westminster Confession of Faith. So that is not like an acceptable position in Reformed congregations. People believe that, right, but that's not an acceptable Reformed position. This also rules out in a lot of ways, and I don't want to spend any time on this, but in a lot of ways it rules out kind of the very nascent current Christian nationalism movement, which suggests that the government should have some say on church affairs, should regulate church doctrine, church affairs, church life. That is also clearly ruled out by the Westminster Confession of Faith. The Westminster Confession of Faith's treatment of the law of God, specifically what does it mean when we say the general equity of the civil law remains? That's going to come up a lot. And then in Westminster Larger Catechism, questions 123 through 133, you'll find it talking about the fifth commandment. What are the duties that inferiors owe superiors, that superiors owe inferiors, etc. All right, so moving on. Here's how I'm going to address this issue. Very sympathetic now to Rob, who said a couple weeks ago in eschatology, I don't have enough time for this subject. And then Tuesday I realized, oh, this is what I did to Rob, because I do not have enough time today to touch on all the issues. If I was to spend 10 minutes, just 10 minutes, trying, if I could even fit a summary of each of these political theologies into 10 minutes, that would still take up 75% of our time together. So instead, I'm going to address these four major ways of thinking about political theology through three major kind of foundational questions about political theology, and then we'll look at their answers rather than defining them themselves. I do want to give you resources. So when it comes to two-kingdom theology, and I restricted myself to 20th century or 21st century authors, because this is, just like everyone's going to claim the Westminster Confession of Faith, everyone is going to claim that John Calvin agrees with them. Everybody. Like across the board. Same thing with Luther, same thing with Augustine. So restricting ourselves to 20th century people, in part because although political theology seeks to apply unchanging eternal biblical truth to a changing world, Politics, by their very nature, are cultural and local. And that means that political theology questions and answers will still be very dependent on the time and place in which you live. And a small picture of this is if you meet Reformed Christians outside of America, most of them will have never heard of or have very little interest in two-kingdom theology, because it very much applies uniquely to kind of our American current system and a lot of the American founding fathers questions. That's not to say that it's rejected everywhere else, but if you were to go to Scotland and talk to Scottish Presbyterians about two-kingdom theology, they'd go, I don't know what that is, or that doesn't really matter to me. That doesn't make it wrong or bad at all, at all. It's just, that's why we were sticking ourselves to kind of 20th century authors, because we're here right now. That's what we're dealing with. So you'll see David Van Drunen, Michael Horton, D.G. Hart. David Van Drunen is an OPC minister. Daryl Hart's an OPC ruling elder, so those are both in our family of churches. I tried to give you an introductory work and a longer work. This is the only time I used the same author for both, but the simple fact of the matter is Dr. Van Drunen is the leading authority on the subject. I think he's a genius. He's a wonderful guy. So he's the place you should go. Living in God's Two Kingdoms is the more introductory, easier book to read. And then Politics After Christendom is more of his like magnum opus that gets into it at length. Now what I also tried to do was to try to give you a good critique of each idea. Because again, I can't define each idea in length. So Keith Matheson, who is, I think he's the president of Reformation Bible College, he's a Ligonier teaching fellow, wrote a very long review on David Van Drunen's book, Living God's Two Kingdoms. And it's a very good, scholastic, accessible, fair kind of critique of that idea. So if you want to take notes for any of this, if you want me to send you the slide for further research, that's fine. Next one. We have what's called the magisterial Reformation. Now this one's harder because kind of like classic premillennialism that Rob was going through, it's an idea that maybe has less proponents as we go through time. Magisterial, literally in Latin magister means teacher, but it was kind of the Reformation idea that the church and the state work in tandem for the reformation of society. So this is what a lot of the Puritans held would be, magisterial Reformation, specifically contrasted with the radical Reformation of the Anabaptists. But modern day people who sound like magisterial reformers, who will promote the cooperation of church and state and aren't quite two kingdom, are people like R.C. Sproul, Kevin DeYoung, and D. James Kennedy. And even there you have quite the spectrum of people. Helpful Works, Church and State is a lecture series that R.C. Sproul did on Ligonier. So it's not a book, but you can either listen to it on audio or video. It's very helpful to kind of explain this view. As a longer treatment, Kevin DeYoung did his doctoral dissertation on John Witherspoon, who if we were including pre-20th century people would be on this list as someone who kind of believes in this compatibilism view. A really good critique is a book called A Secular Faith by Daryl Hart, where he kind of critiques this idea that these two institutions are co-related or codependent in any way. All right, next. Sphere sovereignty. Sphere sovereignty is an idea inside of what's known as Neo-Calvinism. Neo-Calvinism is a big whole branch of Reformed theology. So not only can I not cover all of just sphere sovereignty, I certainly couldn't cover all of Neo-Calvinism. So we're going to take much smaller how Neo-Calvinism relates to political theology is predominantly through an idea called sphere sovereignty. I think I have it on there. I don't. There's just an essay. It's a lecture that Abraham Kuyper gave called Sphere Sovereignty. And that's a very good, just direct introduction to this idea. So sphere sovereignty adherents, Abraham Kuyper, Herman Boffink, barely slipping into my 20th century numbers. Tim Keller would be a more modern, well-known adherent of sphere sovereignty. He's talked about it a good deal. Of course, he's also very different. Kuyper is even very different than Boffink in a lot of ways in how they interact. Works. There was a book that came out not that long ago that Tim Keller wrote a foreword to called City of Man by Michael Gerson. I thought was really interesting. It's kind of a modern day application of sphere sovereignty. Of course, the full one is a book by Abraham Kuyper called Our Program, where he just lays out in very large, like in direct detail, exactly what he thinks, how neo-Calvinists should interact with the government. Interestingly, he talks about the Netherlands a lot, which I think goes to show that political theology is going to necessarily be local and set in time and space. A good critique, which is tough because Bannerman was like right before the Neo-Calvinist movement, but the kind of transformational is a bad word. The Neo-Calvinist kind of common grace theology was already kind of starting, and so that's something that Bannerman critiques in a chapter title of the church and its relationship to the world. All right, last one. The one probably everyone thought of when we said political theology is theonomy. Literally it means God's law. Proponents, Greg Bonson, Gary North, James Jordan. There's an article entitled Theology Primer I found that was a really good kind of non-controversial introduction to the idea of theology by a Baptist pastor named Tom Hicks. There are some big works on theonomy. Theonomy in ethics is kind of considered the standard, but no other standard is the book that Greg Bonson wrote near the end of his life that kind of incorporates all of the critiques of his theonomic system. That's a really good, full-blown understanding of what he's arguing for. Helpful critique. There have not been a small amount of critiques of theonomy, but a good one, a helpful kind of accessible one is, it's just called Theology, a Critique by T. David Gordon. I'm not sure where he teaches now, but for a long time he was at Grove City. Did you have one of his classes? Yeah, so Bradley, there you go. All right, so now we're going to get into the questions. Those are the introductions if you want to do more study. And now we're going to spend the rest of our time talking about the issues. So next slide. Okay. Wow, that picture looks terrible on the screen. It's like a protest. It's a mass protest is the picture. So question number one, and I'm trying to ask big questions to help us touch on kind of the foundational questions in political theology. So the first question I think it's helpful to consider is, how did God structure civil society, our shared life in this world? So we're not talking about the church, we're not talking about families, we're not talking about that cave, we're not talking about your beach house on Boca Raton. Shared life together as humans, civil society, how did God structure it? Now this order isn't, these ideas don't really work on a spectrum. It's really tempted to think that, specifically with maybe the ones we're more thought of in American theology, two kingdoms and theonomy, and we kind of think of them as two pillars, and then you have like radical two-kingdom, borderline Quaker theology off the side and the left, and you have like Christian Reconstructionism, far right of theonomy. I don't think that's helpful to think of it as a spectrum. I kind of want to disabuse us of that notion, because there are a couple of big issues at play, and how you answer them can move polls into some different areas. So, although I tried to group them by agreements, you'll see that they'll move around as I go. So, how did God structure civil society? The whole planet Earth with all the humans in it, how is it broadly structured? Well, two-kingdom theology gets its name because it argues that God has set up for the whole world two fundamental kingdoms. The first is called the common kingdom, and that's found in the Noahic covenant, where God promises to preserve the whole world, everyone in it. And where God, so the argument goes, sets up standards for justice and life together. If a man sheds a man's blood, by another man shall his blood be shed. So it kind of sets up and obviously the Noahic covenant is called a common grace covenant. Everyone agrees on that. So the argument is that the Noahic covenant sets up a common kingdom that applies to every human everywhere. And that common kingdom is their structure for life together. Right? And so it's more specific terms that it's temporary. It's not going to go into the new heavens and new earth. It is accountable to justice. Some of these ideas define the common kingdom. And then God has also established the redemptive kingdom, which is often found in the covenant with Abraham. Two kingdom adherents are going to argue that they were both kind of the same in Adam. Right? You have this redemptive kingdom where life is promised. God is dwelling with man. Man is worshiping God. That's all there. And you also have this common kingdom because there's dominion taking, there's justice, there's life together, there's law. But after the fall, it's not God's desire for us to recreate Eden on earth. And so the whole world is going to be governed by this common kingdom. And then specifically the church is going to live inside of this redemptive kingdom. And that's why the redemptive kingdom doesn't have things like executing civil justice, magistrate armies. The common kingdom takes care of those things. It's a very broad description of how two-kingdom theology thinks life in this world looks. Common kingdom, everybody, applies to everybody equally. Redemptive kingdom for the church. Magisterial Reformation was full of that two-kingdom language, right? It comes from Calvin in a lot of ways, hence the debate. Where did Calvin fall on this? Because he famously wanted the civil magistrate to execute somebody for heresy, so where he falls is not super clear. But this idea that there are different kingdoms is very present in the magisterial Reformation. So kind of Calvin forward to the Puritans. Now they called it a spiritual kingdom and a political kingdom. And so the magisterial Reformation is much more focusing on these two great institutions rather than these broad kingdoms with different purposes, right? So it's going to say that there is a political kingdom, which is the magistrate that we all live in, and then there is a spiritual kingdom, which is the church. And in a sense, everyone's subject to that too, whether or not they know it, right? Whether or not they're an active part of it, they still follow under its rules, they're still held guilty by its standards. So that's the idea, and that means that there is a sense of cooperation then between a political kingdom and the spiritual kingdom, although they are very clearly distinct with distinct rules, covenants, all those kind of things. Sphere sovereignty, especially with kind of, I would say, the growth of Neo-Calvinism over the past 30 or so years after Bobbing and Kuyper and a lot of guys have gotten translated, is hard to define, specifically because there's been a lot of interest in sphere sovereignty in American political theology, kind of trying to co-opt it and use it to different means. So broadly, Abraham Kuyper's famous statement kind of forms the basis, right? There's not one single inch over the universe. There's not one iota over which Christ has not proclaimed mine. So there's going to be this broad acceptance that everything belongs to God, but what Kuyper argues at length is that each individual sphere is meant to have its preserved autonomy. And he lived that out, right? So he started his own denomination that was separate from the state Reformed Church. He started his own university that was separate from the state university. So he believed in these spheres. And so obviously in Neo-Calvinism there's a devotion to proclaiming the supremacy of Christ and kind of in this common grace world, but there's also a pluralism that comes along with having different spheres, right? That God created each according to his kind, and so each kind can have a sphere, and that he applied that even to people who didn't believe in God ought to have their spheres, but that they all kind of live largely under God's new creation, which is another big emphasis in Neo-Calvinism. And then you have theonomy, and one of the things to be with theonomy is it's very straight down the line. I'm not saying there's a good or a bad thing. But theonomy is going to argue, probably some covenanter language here, that everything that exists, every institution that exists, has Christ as its head, and he's meant to rule over it actively, rather than just mediatorily, that everything exists under Christ's direct kingship. So hence, the covenanters would cry out, does anyone know their motto? For Christ's crown and covenant, right? Which would mean both parts of the world are his. So, how does this apply to a lot of smaller topics? Oh, go back, sorry. This is going to come up all the time. Actually, no, let's go forward. Let's go through them all. Bradley's changing my pedagogy on the fly, but let's go through all the big topics. And then if you say, hey, I have a question about how many kingdoms there are, hey, I have a question about government, hey, I have a question about culture, we can jump back to those. So maybe that's a good way to do this. All right, so how is civil society to be governed then? So these ideas are going to correlate, right? How does God set up the world? And then when you're in one kingdom, two kingdoms, a sphere, how are these things supposed to be governed is the next question. There is some commonality here. Michael Horton points this out a lot between the two kingdom ideology and a sphere sovereignty ideology, is that they're both going to emphasize common grace. Two kingdoms is really going to emphasize what is called the natural law, right? And so that's going to come through they're going to appeal to things like Abimelech rebuking Abraham for being unwise, Pharaoh rebuking Abraham for lying, the kind of the presence of justice and knowledge, even among sinful people. People still seem to know and understand that there's such a thing as justice and truth and ordering. And they're even going to, this is going to be their understanding of Romans 2 famous conversation of the law being written on their hearts. What is that referring to? There's a big disagreement there with Neo-Calvinism, but they're going to say the natural law, that there's justice, that there's truth, that things are fair or unfair. That's something that comes from God's common grace covenant. So it's not the same thing as the Noahic covenant, but when God promises in the Noahic covenant to preserve the earth until he's done with it, until his second coming, one of the things that God then does, right, is he preserves natural law so that the world will be preserved, right? So it's not just anarchy and murder and barbarism the whole time. So natural law is not the same thing as common grace. It comes from common grace, right? So it's a little bit distinct because largely, although not all the time, but largely, specifically Neo-Calvinist critiques of two-kingdom theology are going to reject natural law and again just argue for a common grace blessing that goes out upon the world and that it's going to be borne out differently in different cultures, different times, different places. And so sphere sovereignty is going to, again, really heavily emphasize common grace. in the world. It's going to be one of the reasons that Abraham Kuyper argued so much for pluralism in the Netherlands, right? Is the presence of common grace and diversity in culture as a good thing. So those differences are not bad. We can often think they are. The sphere sovereignty argument is those differences are not bad. God will preserve us through common grace. Of course, they're going to turn to the Bible, like all of us are, for wisdom and direction. Now, a little bit of defamation is the magisterial Reformation is still going to argue that civil government should take its cues from special revelation. Rather than natural law, rather than common grace insights, they're going to argue that the Bible is still the standard by which things are to be governed. They're not going to go directly to the Mosaic law as something that should be carried over directly. That's theonomy, right? Theonomy is going to argue that special revelation is the only rule. You'll hear them say frequently, by what standard are things to be governed? And their answer is, the standard has to be the law of God. So for them, special revelation is the only rule how to govern civil society. And specifically, to differing levels, theonomists are going to argue that we should be governed specifically by the Mosaic civil law. The Mosaic economy is what comes to today. Some of them are going to argue that that includes the punishments. And most of them are going to argue, no, the punishments were Israelite, but the laws remain. So we should still punish what they punish. We should not punish what was not punished in the Mosaic law. That's the standard. The magisterial Reformation is going to say, yes, the Bible is the standard for rulers, but not specifically the Mosaic economy, just the law of God as it's revealed across the scriptures, including Proverbs, including Romans, all these kind of things, with maybe some general relation insights. Obviously, that's going to set up a contrast, right? Because if you believe that civil society needs to be governed by special revelation, that is a huge difference from believing that either natural law or just God's common grace provision is sufficient for legitimate governance, right? Because we all understand that illegitimate governance is wrong. So this isn't an argument about pacifism or the American Revolution. We all understand that if, I've given this analogy before, if I show up at your house tomorrow and say, hello, I'm the king of Scottsdale, I've come for my gold, you would say no. That's illegitimate governance. You don't get to just claim you have authority, right? So everyone knows that's a paradigm. So when we're thinking what is justice, what is legitimate governance, what is the goal of government, what should we be working for, praying for, if you believe that government is meant to be directed by special revelation, that's going to change your target in a very big way, versus people who believe that natural law or common grace is going to govern in civil government. Obviously, we can get into that as we raise more questions. Third question, how does Christianity interact with culture? Now, it's easy to go, that's a separate issue from political theology, and in a lot of ways it is, except that almost all forms of governance, are concerned with the lives of the people they govern. And the production of people's lives is the simplest definition of culture. Culture is what people in a time and place produce, right? And so we can't kind of bury the lead. We all have to admit that your view of governance is in part going to affect the culture of the people, right? So for example, if you make homosexuality illegal, would that have a big influence on the culture of an area? Absolutely, yes, it was. The question is, should it? Right? Should the government be concerned with how it affects culture? Should we be concerned? So again, this is not a total treatment of Christ's engagement with culture. That's a huge topic on its own. That's like a 10-week series on its own. But just we're talking about government, right? Do we think, is our political theology, does the Bible say that the government has a role to play in determining what culture looks like and how it acts? So the two-kingdom answer is going to be broadly, no. I had a sillier answer up there. I'm like, I can't do it. It's political theology. But my original answer was, it better not. That's kind of the two-kingdom argument. Michael Horton goes so far as to argue that Christians ought not to make Christian arguments when it comes to politics. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't be Christian or that we shouldn't argue for abortion. What he's saying is you should make those arguments from a natural law perspective, right? So he is obviously not trying for anything we might call transformationalism. That's totally not a part of two-kingdom theology. They're not trying to transform culture. The engagement is really to provide a platform for the free offer of the gospel, right? Our only hope is in the redemptive kingdom. And so when the redemptive kingdom goes out its work and it preaches the gospel and people's lives are transformed and changed, then you'll see the change that you want. Amen, right? So then the job of culture right, is to be just and fair and open and to provide a platform for the free offer of the gospel, amid other things, because if you're not transformationalist, then you're kind of necessarily pluralistic, right? Now, this is, and some people can chime in here if they want to, this is the area where I see the broadest level of disagreement inside of neo-Calvinism and sphere sovereignty, is how exactly the government interacts with culture. Transformationalism is one of the things that neo-Calvinists will get tagged with, sometimes fairly, sometimes not. So I think broadly the best way to understand a sphere sovereignty argument, there's common grace governing, everything's beautiful according to its kind, where Christ is king over everything, so we should promote his truth unabashedly, unafraidedly. That's what governs everything. We're going to allow for pluralism, and so then a good culture and the culture that a government should try to produce is one that will produce human flourishing. And I think that's a broadly kind of good idea of what sphere sovereignty is inducing. Now, obviously, the Bible directs us to human flourishing, right? The Bible proclaims that homosexuality doesn't produce human flourishing, ever, period. It might make you feel happy for a little while, but it is to the detriment of the human race to engage in long-term homosexual relationships. So there is some transformationalism. There is the hope that the truth of Christ, as he reigns over the whole world, will go in and will change the way people look. Depending where you are on the scale is whether the government should be pulling levers. But again, broadly, sphere sovereignty, because there's different spheres, is more pluralistic. And it's more saying the proclamation of the truth, the promotion of Christ's authority and his gospel, well then we want to result in human flourishing. We want people to do well, including Christians, non-Christians. We kind of want everyone to thrive. Obviously, everyone agrees with that. We're just talking about what's the emphasis, right? And I think that's the emphasis of sphere sovereignty. The magisterial reformation and theonomy are both, I think, more clearly transformationalists. They're looking for a change in the culture or in the governments. Another really good example of this, I can't believe I forgot it, he was a professor at RTS Charlotte. His name is Douglas Kelly, and he wrote a book called The Dawn of Liberty. And it's his argument from a magisterial perspective why, when Christianity goes in, it changes countries, governments, and their cultures. That's a very magisterial argument, that they're supposed to work together. So that's probably actually the best book. I have like 10 copies of that because I wasn't paying attention on Amazon a couple years ago, and I thought I put in one and I put in like 11. So I will bring that if anyone wants a free copy on Sunday. So anyway, I'm not pushing that position. I have 10 of those books and I don't need them. So the argument here is that we are looking for transformation, that a government should want transformation in culture towards Christian standards. But the magisterial reformation is going to argue that the government's job is to let the church do that, right? It's the government's job to even actively support the church, find ways to encourage its growth, protect it, sometimes even in this position give it favored status, or the other position might be just to promote it kind of broadly. Proponents of this position are going to point to the language of nursing father in the Westminster Confession. That's something Witherspoon pointed a lot, that the state is a nursing father to the church, so that the church produces a reformation that then produces transformation. But that is a goal for magisterial reformers. That's a goal. We want society to be changed. Again, we all want people to come to Jesus. We all want them to sin less. But an active goal of the government should be social, societal transformation. It's just going to happen through the state promoting the church. Whereas the theonomy agrees, and I'll get to it right after this, and it kind of flips it. And this was a little glib. This is the only time I kind of made a joke, so forgive me. But it's that legislation creates transformation, right? So it's the other way around. The state is going to legislate morality, and one of their arguments is going to be that all legislation is the enforcement of morality. So let's enforce God's morality, and when we punish sin and we reward good, that will greatly decrease sin, that will greatly create good. Normal kind of Presbyterian theonomists aren't arguing it's going to create heaven on earth, but they are going to argue that that's going to have a marked transformation in society that the church is going to participate in. And furthermore, they're going to argue that the decline of America, or the decline of any Western society, they're going to argue is going to come because the civil government wasn't doing this, right? They're going to argue that the pluralism breeds sin and a hard-heartedness to the gospel, and so the state needs to, with its power, transform society according to Christian standards. There are a lot of sub-issues I haven't taught on. I'm kind of relying on all of you to ask questions. Worst case scenario, we can pray for a long time. But Billy, you had the first question. Right. So I'll repeat it for the YouTube. So Billy asked, in the magisterial position with transformation, is it more pluralistic and just we want the church to do well, or is it more biased and not pluralistic? Historically, it's more the latter. It's more specifically promoting the true church, right? One of the things that happened, though, during the Reformation was no one could agree on anything. So the Reformation kind of became a consensus movement by the mere fact that the Presbyterians had to work with the nonconformist Anglicans, had to work with the Congregationalists. So maybe the more clear picture of this is in like the state churches in places like Germany, which just said Lutheranism. You're all Lutheran now. And so they were actively promoting something like Lutheranism. And the Scandinavian churches, similarly, the state churches were Lutheran. So that might be a better example of more common kind of magisterial reformation, is the church was like actually saying, no, 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 we want you to believe that Jesus' body is physically present. Deanna. Right.
You know, like Muslim societies or even like China, which actively
suppresses.
Christianity, I don't see how it works.
It's a great question. So Deanna asked, again, just for YouTube, how does theonomy or magisterial reformation work in countries that aren't Christian or even are actively anti-Christian? So proponents of this position would argue this is one of the reasons we need to get our hands on the reign of the government, right, is to stop the persecution, to try to start to change things. And so really this question is going to come out, if you are in one of those places, do you consider one of your Christian duties to simply be, kind of in a more two-kingdom position, just to proclaim the redemptive kingdom, proclaim the gospel, let people be transformed? Is your job to do that in a more broader common grace way with neo-Calvinism, to kind of engage with the differences? Is it in a magisterial reformation you would say we need to work on reformation and grow the church, but we need to be constantly telling the civil magistrate, you shouldn't be doing this. You shouldn't be practicing Sharia, right? And we should maybe even be protesting Sharia in the streets. And then theonomy is going to be, that's really more the position where it's like, well, one of the things we all need to be doing is getting our hands on the reins of the government so that this stops happening. So to your point, Deanna, how does it work in a country that's not Christian? To very different levels, but the magisterial position and the theonomistic position are going to be, well, we need to change that. Whereas if you have a more neo-Calvinist, if you have a neo-Calvinist position, you're like, we're going to change that, but it's going to happen this other way, right? And it's not even changing the government, it's more like a cultural engagement, whereas two kingdom is like, we're not going to change that. It's God's desire that it be ruled by not us, and we're just going to preach the gospel. So it really becomes, to Deanna's question, what's our job when we're in that situation? If that makes sense. Yeah. Okay, Rob, and then Doug.
I think another thing that's helpful in distinguishing between the sphere sovereignty view and the two kingdom view is the sphere sovereignty view doesn't look at there being only two spheres.
Right.
They've got a bunch of spheres. The family is a sphere.
Right.
And it should have a level of autonomy and sovereignty.
Yeah.
Government, arts
science,
right,
right.
Are separate things.
Right.
Education.
Right.
And as a result, you can see them looking to build up human flourishing without just a binary view.
Right.
As two kingdoms can tend to do.
Right.
Is this political or is it spiritual?
Right.
And that's kind of all they talk about. And when you get to things like the family, things like cultural engagement that's not political,
Right.
those sorts of things, it's a little bit more challenging for that to answer, whereas sphere sovereignty is very intentionally recognized law.
Right. So I'll repeat again what Rob said, which is a good clarification. one of the things you're like, man, is this going to get up there or not? And so I'm thankful you said it. Sphere sovereignty is not just two, right? And so actually in his paper, his speech called On Sphere Sovereignty, one of the things that Kuyper talks about most is actually science. He's like, science is a sphere. So to Rob's point, what Rob said was, the spheres are numerable. There's family, there's church, there's state, there's arts, there's science, there's education. So there can be a lot of different places of engagement. In building, that was another, I had another slide they got rid of, but I think building is a good word to describe kind of a neo-Calvinist, is you want to be building things, and they're in different spheres, and that's a good clarification by Rob versus just the two kingdoms that exist in a two-kingdom position. Doug?
I was going to make the same point
Yeah.
about that. But I think also with sphere sovereignty, talk about neo-Calvinism, you did discuss the idea of worldview.
Right.
And in all these views, talk a little bit about nature and grace.
Right.
So those are always like competing ideas.
Yeah.
Does grace consume nature?
Right.
Does it do away with it?
Right.
Does it elevate it? You know,
Right.
That's a helpful way to look at it. But
Yeah.
I think too, and you're trying to stay with current authors,
Right.
but all of them are gaining these understandings about the way that you look at culture and different other. So
Right.
two kingdoms. Van Drunen's looking at early Reformation,
Right.
and you see like this dialogue between nature and grace, two kingdoms
Yeah.
that they probably got from Augustine.
Right, and Aquinas, yeah.
Magisterial Reformation is a little bit later,
Right.
where they're looking at what does it mean to have to be a Christian kingdom,
Right.
right? And then when it comes to neo-orthodoxy or neo-Calvinism and Bobbing, they're up against some really interesting
Yeah.
changes in the way they see the world.
Yeah.
Ever.
Right. Right.
So I don't know. Comment on that or.
That's a really good point. And I think what Doug did was he more deeply fleshed out my point that political theology is going to be influenced heavily by the world in which we live and even ancestors in which we pull from, right? And so to Doug's point, two kingdom theology is going to look at the early Reformation, and it's going to look at, like as he mentioned, conversations between nature and grace and how those relate to each other. Just to throw a total wrench in the pipes, which is probably the exact opposite of the clarification that Doug just brought, but I have the mic, is modern commentators like N.T. Wright, who almost just totally blow past all of it in their kind of theology of a new creation. So one of the things, kind of one of the unchallenged assumptions from pretty much everyone except for theonomists, is that the culture that we build, the kingdoms that we build aren't going to go into the new heavens, the new earth. You're not going to take it with you. And N.T. Wright says, but maybe, right? Maybe we are. Maybe there's a radical continuity between the new. He's very big on the new creation and how it kind of fulfills who we are as human beings and how we kind of grow out of it. So, and that's coming a lot of what N.T. Wright's dealing with when it comes to also nature and grace as well. So just to Doug's point, I actually think the best thing to do is to encourage you, and I'm going to take questions and I'm going to end with a little speech on like why this matters. But I think to Doug's point, what's really helpful is to not just study the theology, but to learn the context that it's coming out of, right? And most of these authors are good enough that they'll do that. Van Drunen will tell you where he's coming from. Kuyper will tell you where he's coming from. But I think that's a really good point that Doug's making, that you want to know the context that they're coming out of and the movements they're coming out of, because that'll help you shape, I think, a more well-rounded understanding. One of the struggles with political theology is we get very black and white and binary, right? And we're like, all theonomists want to stone adulterers. And you're like, well, hold on. Some of them do. Not all of them do. All two kingdom people think it's wrong to engage with the government. No, right? So I think to Doug's point, to really learn where they're coming out of, what they're pulling from, helps us create a more fair and more broad spectrum of what they believe. So more questions. Yes, Kimberly. Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So I deleted a lot of slides because I was like, this is not a topic that benefits from endless blocks of text. One of the main arguments in political theology is, how does the Mosaic law apply to modern day society, right? And that even is going to be really, kind of to Doug's earlier point, influenced by your view of like republication and how the Mosaic covenant works altogether. But to your point, theonomy is not the only one, it's not the only position up here that believes that the Old Testament civil laws have something to say about modern day government, right? Magisterial reformers would agree with that as well. Even some two-kingdom people, that's a good point, right? Because of the general equity. Yeah, second table of the law, right? Murder, stealing, those kind of things. So yeah, it would be very possible to say the two-kingdom, the Noahic covenant, that makes total sense to me. The two-kingdom position is going to argue very heavily that the right paradigm for us as Christians is exile. We're not Israel in the land, we're Israel in Babylon. And they're going to point to Babylon is how the book of Revelation seems to talk about the world we live in. It calls it Babylon, Babylon, Babylon. So if we are in Babylon, right, then I can believe that. I can be a two-kingdom person, but I can also then believe, but I'm going to tell Babylon to obey their parents and to stop stealing. And I'm going to believe, and I'm going to be two-kingdom, but maybe I'm going to have a more neo-Calvinist understanding of culture, right? And I'm going to want to build things because, man, I read Jeremiah, and Jeremiah tells them to build houses. And I'm like, man, and I want to build houses, but I want to build schools, and I want to build hospitals. So you could maybe have a neo-Calvinist view on culture with a two-kingdom overarching understanding of the civil world with a really hard emphasis on the utility of the Mosaic law. You could. Now, at some point, some of them are going to start to contradict, right? You can't believe that the civil government is supposed to legislate, transformationalism if you're two-kingdom and you believe that God does not want to transform the Noahic world. That is, God doesn't want it. You're actually more or less disobeying God by seeking something he's not ordered you to do. So there are limits to where you can pick and pull. But part of the point of this was that, one, theonomists, neo-Calvinists internally exist on spectrums, and two, you probably will, it'll be muddled, right? So that's a good question by Kimberly. Art? Oh, okay, just stretching the wrong time. Bradley? Right. Sure. Right. Oh, yeah. It's a very spicy question. I deleted that slide with a vengeance on Monday. I had a whole political theology in the OPC, and I said, nope. And then there comes Bradley to my demise. The OPC is, other people have said it, it's a little denomination that carried a big stick. For whatever reason, in God's providence, there's been a lot of very prominent scholars and theologians and historically important pastors in our denomination. So you have Bonson, who is the main proponent of theonomy in 20th century America, was in the OPC. You have Van Drunen, who is the main opponent of the exact opposite, is also in the OPC. You have even someone like Cornelius Van Til, who in a lot of ways, kind of, for good reason, with Machen, is kind of viewed as like kind of a founding father of the OPC. And Van Til slots into the Calvin spot for us, where every one of these positions is going to claim Van Til agreed with them. Right? Bonson's very sure that Van Til was a theonomist, despite a lot of letters we have where Van Til says, I'm not a theonomist. But Bonson was very sure, right? He was Dutch, right? Van Til had a lot of correspondence with the Dutch theologians, so there's certainly some neo-Calvinism there. A lot of the two-kingdom guys are big Van Til people, so if you can tell me clearly punting on first down, the OPC has it all. We have maybe the biggest proponents of almost every position in our denomination. You will find theonomists, obviously, in the OPC. They're not the majority or the plurality, but to Deanna's point, though, Deanna asked, how does this work in a non-Christian country? By any conceivable data metric, right, America has for a couple of years now been a post-Christian country, right? And so I think that's a part of the reason you see theonomists in the OPC and outward getting louder, because it's actually a very natural outflow of their beliefs. This is going the wrong direction. We need to change this. So rather than attributing to them being, ugly or whatever, it's just, that they should be concerned about this with their views. So I guess what I would say is theonomists tend to be the loudest about this. but they are not the majority or plurality inside the OPC. Broadly speaking, the OPC, I think, leans more neo-Calvinist into kingdom than it leans magisterial or theonomist. But I think, I'm not sure I would say the same thing about like the PCA, for example. We talked last week actually that how the Southern Presbyterianism was influenced by Scottish Presbyterianism. Scottish Presbyterianism was very magisterial or even covenanter, right? And so you'll find, I mean, in denominations like the RPCNA, theonomy is the position, right? That's the position. There isn't so much diversity on it. So, but anyway, if anyone wants to chime in on the OPC question, I refuse to mantle it on myself. Bradley. Sure. More questions I was hoping not to get. So maybe I'll be a little spicy. Reconstructionism is beyond the pale. It is a more radical form of theonomy that was largely promoted by someone called Rousas Rushdoony, who was in the OPC at one point, but then was not in the OPC, if that says anything, and it should. So Reconstructionism is far more aggressive than regular kind of run-your-mill theonomy, that you can tell by the term. One is kind of expecting like a collapse of society because of their sin. They're going to adopt very judgmental language. I guess maybe, and if there's any reconstructionists here, number one, I have questions, but number two, you can rebuke me. If I said earlier that the two kingdom position is that we are Israel in exile, not Israel in the Holy Land, and then all the other positions kind of, are debating how that all works. Reconstruction is almost just very clearly, no, we're Israel in the Holy Land, and we need to make it that way now. And we need to urgently deconstruct and then reconstruct civil society, education. Sometimes they almost sound like sphere sovereignty in the way that they think of these different pillars. Pillarization is another term we use. So they're going to be arguing like we need to tear these things down. And so you're going to see this is largely, I'm not trying to make a Harry Potter point, but these would kind of be the people to be like, Harry Potter's satanic, we need to tear it out, get it out of the way, we need to replace it with David and Goliath. No one got that reference? Thank you. It was a really weird Christian claymation TV show a long time ago. So yes, Reconstruction is much more aggressive. It's arguing a primary purpose of the church is the reconstruction of society rather than what we believe about how it works. And it totally changes the mission of the church, the spirituality of the church. It just completely rejects these things, and that's a bridge too far. Yes?
Not to try to muddy things.
Right. Nice.
One of the things that also sort of distinguishes the four views when it comes to both the political authority thing and the cultural interaction in general is how they differentiate between the role of the institutional church versus the individual Christian. So
right.
for example, two kingdom theology would say, generally speaking,
right.
the church should not be speaking to government.
Right.
But individuals
are free to.
May be called to do that.
Right.
And they may be called to serve in government. They may be called to hold the levers of government.
Right.
But when they are acting as representatives of the institutional church, that's not an appropriate venue. And each one of those views kind of looks at the differentiation between
right.
the institutional church and those that make up the church in slightly different ways.
That's a really good point, which was another slide I deleted. But Rob's talking about, so there's kind of two questions for us. How am I as an individual Christian supposed to engage with my local government? And again, I think the biggest questions you need to answer is, am I living in a Noahic covenant where we're never going to run the show and God doesn't want me to? Even if you think, then I'm still allowed to participate. How you're going to participate is going to be very different than saying it's God's express will that this government be run according to Christ's crown and covenant. And so, to Rob's point, one, kind of after we settle these big questions, then we ask, what's the Christian's responsibility? What's the church's responsibility? So very quickly, the Christian's responsibility to kingdom, free to participate, certainly not mandatory. The two kingdom position on the institutional churches, it's not the church's job. sphere sovereignty is going to encourage building. Famously, Abraham Kuyper was the Prime Minister of the Netherlands for 4 years, to very mixed opinions, it should be said. But I've never been the Prime Minister of anything, so take that for what you will. So it's going to encourage building and participation in kind of a common grace way, but it's going to pillarize these sovereignties separately, right? So the church has its job, the state has its job. It really comes through, maybe it's the biggest distinctive in the magisterial Reformation, where they're going to argue the church and the state should be working together. And the word Calvin uses for it is codependent, which makes me laugh when I read it, because you kind of imagine like a codependent sitcom couple. Well, I didn't know when you were coming home. Well, you never told me I needed to come home. And that's just, sometimes it feels like how the church and the state interact with each other. Codependent. He didn't mean it that way, of course. It's kind of like how I think it's The Great Divorce, C.S. Lewis saying that life in heaven is too good for carnal desires. He says that everyone in heaven will be a transsexual. He didn't mean that in 1940 the way that we mean it now. So when Calvin says that the church and state are codependent, what he means is he is arguing that they should have a consistent cooperation, which is something you saw in Geneva between the consistory and the local town council. And it should be mentioned, this is a good place to end on before I give my speech. Just as to get a fully overview of these things, almost all theonomists will argue against Erastianism. Like OPC theonomists, PCA theonomists, they're not going to want them to literally be the same thing. They both want them run according to, direct commandments from God, right? But they're still going to argue that just because I'm a pastor of a church doesn't mean I should also be the president of the Senate. So even in most mainstream theonomic proposals, they're going to be extremely aligned, same governed, united bodies, but they're still going to affirm, they're not Erastians, they're still going to affirm that just because someone's qualified to be a pastor doesn't mean they should be president, or vice versa. So they're still actually even going to have those separations, but much different. So here's my final speech to end, and then as always, stay as late as you want asking questions. We just want to give people the out as the night goes on. We always end with, why does this matter? This is not a hard pitch to give to Americans, right? Might be a harder pitch to give to a Zimbabwean or a New Zealander. New Zealandite? New Zealandai? I think it's New Zealandai. Kiwi. Oh, yeah, there you go. Yeah. I thought that was pejorative. All right. Terrible fruit. So, you don't need to tell an American, hey, your political theology matters. We have been born in this and raised in it, right? We've been told for a long time that your politics matters. So, knowing that you already know your politics matters as an American, let me put it this way. In all things, your relationship with Christ and His Word is preeminent. And so political theology is very important that you do your theology first and your politics second. Even as I'm restudying this, and I've kind of done a migration of my own in the past couple years, the tendency to say, I want this, therefore I'm a Kuyperian. I want that, therefore I'm a theonomist. That temptation is so strong in our hearts. And that's not the way we engage with the Word of God, right? We don't find arguments in it that suit our purpose. We are mastered by it. It is the teacher, we are the student. And so, if you already know that political theology matters, let me just urge you to take time to study, to read these things. It does matter, but to do it from theology. What do you really believe the Bible is saying? Right? And if it results in some uncomfortable conclusions about how it affects your politics, good. It probably should, right? If you find a political theology and it perfectly aligns with all of your preconceived political ideals, that's probably suspect. It could totally happen. But that's my pitch here, is to do your political theology first. Read what God has to say to the Israelites in the land and in exile. Read Romans 13. Read how Calvin and Witherspoon and Kuyper and Kevin DeYoung and Van Drunen talk about Romans 13. Pray to God that He would reveal, His truth to you. Consider what it means to live in a common grace world and society. Consider these things deeply, because although I don't want to offend anybody, none of our votes materially matter, right? That's not really where this is going to come out. I didn't want to give a whole hour lecture on political theology so that you would vote the right way on Proposition 12. But boy howdy, does political theology affect the way you hear the news when you're watching it at 7 o'clock. Boy howdy, does it change the way you affect your neighbor. the way you see your local school, the way you see your local magistrate, the way you pray for them. These things are a big part of our life, and they're very much governed by this. So I think this is definitely something we should devote ourselves to. I always end with this disclaimer too. I know that you can't, if you don't have positions on any of these, that's totally okay. We had someone ask that last week. What if I haven't heard any of this before? That's the point of the series. We're growing. I understand that in the next 2 weeks, you can't come up with a view on days of creation and eschatology and church offices and political theology. No one's expecting you to. But grow yourself, right? Devote yourself to something. And if this is an area where you're like, hey, I don't have a political theology, I like to have my understanding informed by the Bible and by the Spirit, then it's a good thing to devote yourself to. So, with that, I'll close in prayer, and then, as always, stay as late as you want, hang out, talk. Water, I think, is the only drink we have, but it's free. So, let's pray. Heavenly Father, this is a heavy topic. Depending on your position, it's a heavenly topic. But Lord, we know that you desire for us to live according to your will in this world. And we confess with our whole hearts that it is not a mistake that you have kept us here. It is your desire for us to be born here, to live here, to work here, to eat here, to drink here, to sleep here, and most possibly and probably to die here. And so, Lord, we desire to know how to serve you in this fallen world. We desire to be a light unto the nations. We desire to be salt. We desire to be someone who can give an answer for the hope that's within us, which is Jesus. And so, Father, we do pray that you would open our eyes to your truth, that you would give us a hunger for your word, that we would dive deep, that we would not be afraid of controversy or disagreement, Lord, but that we would truly and earnestly seek what your word says about our life in this earth. Lord, teach us to pray consistently for those you have placed in authority over us, to pray for their good, for their salvation, for their blessing, not simply for our own means. Father, teach us to be good citizens and neighbors. Father, as we build houses and take jobs in this world, reveal to us how to do so with the grace and kindness we know you demand of your people. Father, let us know truth. Let us proclaim it according to our conscience and our conviction with grace and with boldness. Father, continue to reform your church according to your word. Take away from us every bias, every weight that slows us down from following Jesus. Father, let us focus on the first things first, the proclamation of the gospel, the trustworthiness of the scriptures, the hope of resurrection. Father, let us focus on these things. Let us make them first and foremost in our lives, in our hearts, in our church, and our public proclamation, Lord, and use doctrines like this to give us firmness to our faith, deepness to our understanding, all so that we can better serve and glorify you. Father, because all these things are for you, and we ask for all of them in Jesus' holy name. Amen. So next week is Tim, and if you thought this week was spicy, next week Tim's talking